Welcome to part 5 of my 8-part series on science in the Bible. I strongly suggest that you listen to the parts in sequence. Enjoy! Okay, well tonight we're going to have a little bit of a review of what we talked about last time, and we're going to move into the big topic, which is the topic of Darwinian evolution. So please get comfortable. Okay. Now here's our course outline. Tonight we're going to be focusing on the origin of life, the fossil record, and the biblical flood. And if any of you are wondering where dinosaurs are going to come into the picture, it will probably be next week, but we will talk about it. Okay? Now, just so you know, I have published a book. It's an e-book. I don't know why this thing is making such bad noise. It's an e-book. It's available on Amazon. And if you're interested in getting it, I have a piece of paper up here which will tell you more easily how to search for it and download it. Okay, but I don't want to turn this into an advertisement. All right, well, let's review what we saw from session 2. We're going to hit the big points. Okay, we saw that there are two fundamental laws of physical processes. The first law is that mass energy is always conserved. It can't be created or destroyed. You can convert mass into energy and energy back into mass, but the total is always the same. And therefore, the total amount of mass energy in any closed system, including the universe as a whole, is a constant. Now, hang on a second. Let's hope that goes away. The second law, very interesting. The second law is that in any physical process, entropy will either increase or remain the same, and that means that available useful energy, order, or information will either be conserved or it will be lost. It will never gain. So the first law says that you can't get something from nothing. And the second law says that you either lose or you break even. In other words, everything decays, everything runs down. And we all know this from our experience. Now, we spent some time last week talking about the uncaused cause. And we discovered that there are really only two options when we consider the uncaused cause. Either there's an infinite series of causes going backward in time in an eternal sequence that has no beginning, or an externally existing uncaused cause created the universe and started the chain of causes which we call our universe. Now, if the first choice is true, the universe itself is the eternal, self-existing, uncaused cause. If the second one is true, the eternal, self-existing, uncaused cause is what we call God. Now, by the way, this doesn't prove that the God of the Bible is the true God. That takes more discussion. But really, these are the only options. Either the universe itself, in some sense, is divine, or God, who is outside of and greater than the universe, created it. Now, we began to talk last time, and I think this is where we stopped. We were talking about qualities of the universe. And if you think about our universe, it's physical, it's enormous, it's beautiful, and it's varied. It's orderly. Matter obeys natural law, which is really quite an amazing thing to think about it. It's complex and it's interdependent. Everything is interacting with everything else. And you can particularly see this in the living world, but it's also true of the non-living world. Now, our universe is also functioning. Things are happening. Matter is in motion. Living things are growing and dying and reproducing. Things are happening. Now, the universe is recent. Now, recent is a relative term, right? Is it recent in terms of thousands of years? Is it recent in terms of billions of years? When I say it's recent, what I mean is it's not infinitely old, because if it were infinitely old, heat death would have stopped everything. Okay? Now, our universe has metrics of matter, space, and time. We've got 3 physical dimensions. We've got time, and there may be other dimensions that we don't know about. Now, the universe also seems to show evidence of purpose. If you look at the environment of the Earth, and you think about all the things that have to be just right, the distance of the Earth from the sun, the amount of gravity that the Earth has, the things that are necessary to create an environment in which life can survive are very, very finely tuned. And if that tuning wasn't right, you couldn't have life on Earth. I won't talk about that much in this course, but there are many good books that discuss this. Now, the Earth is full of self-replicating, reproducing, symbiotic life. Symbiotic means that different animals interact with each other and they need each other. Flowers need bees. Termites need protozoans. Do you know that termites can't digest food? Can't digest wood? Termites cannot digest wood. They chew wood, it goes into their stomachs, and there are protozoans, I believe, that digest the wood for them. If the protozoans weren't there, they'd starve. And the living world is full of things like this. The living world has persons with consciousness and spirituality. And human beings and angels are moral beings who know good and evil. Now, that leads to an important question. What kind of uncaused cause could have created this universe? Well, let me give me just a second. I think I can fix this. Worse? Probably worse. Okay, let's hope it holds together. I'll get a new mic during the break. Okay. Since a cause must be capable of producing its effects, what must we conclude regarding uncaused cause? Now, can you go up there and get me a new mic? Thank you. All right, let's think about the universe in broad terms, okay? It's finite in its size and in its qualities. It's big, but it's finite. It's recent in time. It contains personal beings, and those personal beings are moral beings. Now, the uncaused cause must be able to create all those things, and that suggests that the uncaused cause is infinite, that the uncaused cause is eternal, that the uncaused cause is personal, the uncaused cause is righteous. You see, impersonal matter can't create beings with consciousness, with morality, and with spirituality. Now, what do we call this kind of a being? We call it God. All right? So, as we move to the end of our discussion of the origin of the universe and begin to discuss life, I want to suggest this conclusion. Although sinful humans seek to suppress the truth, creation of the universe by a personal God is the only logical explanation. And although it's possible that God worked through a Big Bang-like event, such an event could not arise by itself. Any purely materialistic explanation of cosmogony, the origin of all things, fails. Cause, now you can hear me well. Fails. I'll shout. Right? It fails because the universe clearly contains non-material things. It contains consciousness, personality, and spirituality, and these can't arise from plain matter. Okay, so, I'm just going to turn it. Now it works. All right, I have to hold this pose. Isn't this kind of a creator worthy of our admiration, our appreciation, our worship, and our service? And if you're a Bible believer, I believe answer this question, yes. Okay? All right. We're going I'm not going to move at all. We are going to move on to the topic of Darwinian evolution. I hope Sam gets here soon. Just turning it off. Okay. We're going to start that by discussing something called the Hegelian dialectic. It's the foundational idea behind Darwin's theory of evolution. It's not something that most people are familiar with, but I think you'll see as we go through our discussion of it, that it's something that is part of many, many areas of modern academic thought. Okay? Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
All right, good. Dialectic theory goes back at least as far as ancient Greece. Now, it began as a study of politics, and people who were doing what they call dialectic theory. By the way, dialectic sounds like dialogue, because this is about interaction between persons. They were trying to understand how two opposing groups of people could come to some kind of an agreement or a resolution. So the basic picture is this. You've got party one with its ideas and goals, and party two with its ideas and goals. Now, this could be two modern political parties. It could be a husband and a wife. It could be two warring nations. And they interact. It would typically be interaction by communication, by speaking. They go back and forth. And after they've interacted for a while, they come to a conclusion. Now, this conclusion is an agreement or a compromise or some other kind of resolution. Now, much later, a guy named G.W.F. Hegel came along. He was a German philosopher. He was a pantheist. And he decided to adopt this concept to an effort to understand how the world worked in terms of interactions between nations. Hegel believed in something that he called the Weltgeist. Weltgeist is German for the world spirit. Now, the Weltgeist wasn't God. It was something that was sort of in people that made people interact. That's why he was a pantheist. He believed that God was sort of in everything. And others took his ideas and they went further. They developed what we today call the Hegelian dialectic. Now, Hegel probably wouldn't be happy with what they did, but they put his name on it, and he's dead now, so we can't stop me from using the label. Okay? The Hegelian dialectic is a theory about how systems develop and change through time by the interaction of two opposing parts or forces. Okay, that's the basic Hegelian dialectic. Now let me show you what it looks like graphically. You start with something called the thesis. The thesis is some initial condition, it's some process that's going on, it's some state of affairs. And then something comes along called the antithesis. Now you can see it's really anti-thesis. The antithesis is a condition or an event that opposes or acts upon the thesis. So when these two things interact with each other, there's a result. And the result is, just give me the mic. No. That's right. Give me a second here. How are we now? Praise God. Okay. Much easier on my case. All right, the synthesis is a new state of affairs that is more highly developed. Now, in a sort of mathematical way, we say thesis plus antithesis leads to synthesis. And it's generally assumed that the synthesis is going to be a higher or improved state. Now, this concept swept through the academic world starting in the mid-1800s. And there are many evolutionary theories in the world based on the Hegelian dialectic. I'm going to introduce you to a few of those. Okay? First, we're going to look at Hegelian theories of social evolution. And when I say social, I'm talking about things involving people. Right? One major theory, some of you may be aware of this, is what's called the history of religions theory. I'll explain that to you in a moment. The Hegelian dialectic was applied to economics, and that's where Marxism and communism come from. And it was applied to literature, particularly to theories regarding how the completed Bible came into existence. Now let's look at these just briefly. The history of religions theory, which blossomed in the middle and late 1800s, said that humanity has progressed religiously from pantheism, remember pantheism is the idea that everything is divine, to animism, this is the idea that animals are divine, to polytheism, this is the idea that there are many gods, to henotheism. Now henotheism is an interesting one. Henotheism is the belief that there are many gods, but there's one chief above all of those gods. This was the religion in Egypt for a brief period of time when Akhenaten was pharaoh. Some of you may have heard about him. And then finally, religion advances to monotheism. Monotheism would be what we have in Christianity, or in Islam, or in Judaism. Now, this is a theory. It really doesn't match history, but this is a theory that people came up with. Okay? Now, Marxism and communism say that human society will progress by a class struggle. That's the thesis and the antithesis. The bourgeois and the working class, for example, clashing with each other. And society will move from capitalism next to socialism and finally to communism. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't understand about this theory is that you have to go through socialism first. And that's why the USSR was called the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Right? It wasn't called communist, because communists understand that according to this theory, you have to go through socialism first in order to reach communism. Okay, this is a Hegelian dialectic theory. Now, these three theories are descriptions, and as far as I'm concerned, they're all wrong. But these are people's attempts to explain how the Bible came into existence by a naturalistic process. And what they're really doing is they're denying the inspiring work of the Holy Spirit. Okay? All three of these basically say that the Bible is the end product of a long period of collection, adaptation, and intentional modification of existing literature and folk traditions. Now, anybody who takes the Bible seriously is not going to agree with this view, but this is very popular in the modern academic world. So you can see that the Hegelian dialectic theory has been applied in social theory quite heavily. Well, it's also been applied in the popular press. Now, I went on the web last week, just typed in Hegelian dialectic, and I came up with this picture. Now, this is very interesting. This is from an Australian newspaper on August 9th, 2013, and I'll read it to you if you can't read it. It says up here, agenda, centralization of power. Thesis, manufactured terrorist threat. Antithesis, repressive police state. Synthesis, removal of freedoms, transfer of power from the many to the few. Okay. Now, the person who wrote this article was using the Hegelian dialectic in an attempt to explain how there are actually people in high places creating terror attacks in order to strengthen the power of the state. Now, I'm not putting this up here because I agree with what this guy is saying. I'm putting this up here because I want you to see that this is an idea that is out there. It's very popular in the academic world. Okay? Now, please notice that intelligence and purpose are involved here, because he says behind the whole thing is an agenda, a desire to centralize power. Now, the Hegelian dialectic is also applied in the physical sciences to understand the existence of complex life, and this is where we come to Darwin's theory of evolution. This is what Darwin said, basically. He said complex life is the product of a long sequence of life and death in which random beneficial mutations are selected, preserved, and propagated by the impersonal process of natural selection. Now, we're going to be examining this in quite a bit of detail, all right? But I want you, before we do that, to notice the differences between the uses of the Hegelian dialectic in social evolution theories and biological evolution. All of these social theories involve development by the intelligent interaction of personal human beings, right? These are social theories. They have to do with people interacting. But when you apply the Hegelian dialectic to biology, you are dealing with an impersonal process. In fact, you could argue, and I think this is the case, that Darwin was looking for an explanation for the existence of complex life that excluded the involvement of any intelligence in getting us to where we are. Now, there's much debate about whether Darwin was really trying to undermine belief in God or not. Personally, I think there is some evidence to suggest that he was, but it is not entirely clear. But this is a purely impersonal process, whereas all of these are personal processes. And if you think about the Hegelian dialectic, it goes back to what? Interaction between people. So when Darwin took this thing and applied it to biology, he was making a huge leap. He was taking a theory that was designed for interaction between intelligent beings and applying it to a purely material, non-personal process. Okay? I think I just backed up. Okay, let me go forward through this again. And so now we come to the debate on origins, the origin of life. I wanted you to have that background because it's vital for you to understand what's going on here. Okay, now, there is an obvious fact. Nobody doubts this. The earth is full of life. So the issue of debate is this: where did life come from? Okay, there are two common answers. Biblical creationism says that God directly designed and created all living things by his spoken word as described in the first two chapters of Genesis. Now, I'm going to quote to you from the National Association of Biology Teachers in the United States. This is their official definition of Darwinian evolution. Life is the outcome of an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, natural process affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments. This is what children are taught in the U.S. Okay, this is basically what they're taught in most civilized countries. Okay, that's the description of Darwinian evolution. Notice the emphasis on natural selection. Now, natural means without God, right? Chance, we all know what that is. Historical contingencies, that's things that just happen to happen. And changing environments. There's nothing personal here. There's nothing involving design. All right? Now, let's think about some of the issues that are involved in this debate. The debate is complex and it has very far-reaching consequences. Right? Physical issues. Your theory on the origin of life is going to influence your view of the age of the Earth, the age of the universe, what the fossil record is telling us. It's going to influence your view of genetics. It's even going to influence your view of linguistics. Now, I didn't talk about this, but most modern theories of language say that language evolved. This is why we see all those old caveman movies. People are running around and they just grunt at each other because they haven't figured out how to talk yet. But the Bible says something very different. The Bible gives us a picture of God creating Adam and Eve, and he didn't create them as babies, he created them as adults. He created them with functioning intellects and with full capabilities of language. So you can see that there are two very different views here. But there are also spiritual and moral issues. Depending on your view, you're going to have a different view of the nature of mankind. You're going to have a different view of the origin of death. Now we're going to see that Darwinism basically says that death creates life. The Bible says something quite different. The Bible says that death is a penalty for sin. This is going to affect your view of morality versus nihilism. Now here I'm using nihilism basically to mean that life has no meaning and that once you die, it's all over, and there really is no good or bad. There's just might makes right. Your view on this subject is going to affect your view possibly being a deist, or a theist, or an atheist. That's going to affect your view on eugenics. Eugenics has to do with creation of superior human beings. In some cases, it has to do with euthanasia, getting rid of supposedly inferior human beings. Okay, so there's a lot at stake here. Now we're going to start by examining Darwinism and then neo-Darwinism. Okay. All right, well let me describe to you in a visual way Darwin's original theory of evolution. Okay, I've tried to picture this for you in a very easy way to follow. Now basically, we've got an existing member of species A that reproduces, and a mutant offspring is born. A change in the environment selects that mutant for survival in preference over its siblings, and we get a new species. So this is what it looks like. We start with a source species, which we'll call species A. Now this existing animal reproduces, and it produces lots of children, and most of them are just like it. But then something funny happens, and a mutant is born, and the mutant is different than the parent. Now, the environment begins to change. Something in the world where this creature lives changes, and that puts stress on the survival of all these creatures. So they move forward through time, and because of the changing environment, the normal offspring die, but the mutant is able to survive. And so this surviving mutant reproduces, and he creates a new species. And this event in which he survives in preference to his brothers and sisters who are all dead is what's called natural selection. Okay? Now, let me illustrate this for you by a silly story. All right, I'm going to make up a story. Let's imagine that there is a small island out in the Pacific, and on that island there's a big population of rabbits, and the rabbits are really happy. They're living in balance with their environment. And then one day there's a typhoon, and the typhoon just happens to blow several pairs of a predatory bird from another island to our island. And these predatory birds are having a great time eating rabbits. Now, the rabbit population is going down, 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 and it's looking bad for the rabbits. But then one day, one mama rabbit pops out a mutant, and this mutant has a shell like a turtle. Now, you all know that when a predatory bird attacks an animal, it has to dig its claws into the flesh of the animal. Well, the shell of a turtle repels claws. So our new super rabbit, who has the shell of a turtle, cannot be caught by the predatory birds. Well, what have we just had? We have had a source species, the normal rabbit, the arrival of a mutant, and the mutant now has a capability that allows it to survive in an environment where its brothers and sisters can't survive. That is the event of natural selection. Now, Darwin's theory basically said this: as environments change and as mutants appear, some of those mutants will have no advantage in survival. Some of those mutants will actually have disadvantages in survival and they will die off. But occasionally a mutant will come along that's better adapted to survival in the new environment, and that's where we get new species. Now, by the way, that's why Darwin's book is titled The Origin of Species. It's not the origin of life, it's the origin of species. Now, it's also important for us to keep in mind that the definition of a species is a kind of animal that can only reproduce with others of its own kind. Right? Rabbits don't reproduce with snakes. Dogs don't reproduce with cats, because they're all different species. Now, can you see how this is an example of the Hegelian dialectic? The thesis is the existence of the original species and the appearance of the mutant. The antithesis is the changing environment, and the synthesis is the creation of the new species. Okay? It's very, very Hegelian. Now let's just look at how modern science has pictured this process with the development of human beings. And here's the question: is mankind a stage in a process, or is he a pinnacle of divine design? Darwinists would say that he's just a stage in a process. The Bible says that man is a pinnacle of divine design. Now, you've all seen pictures like this, right? These are very common in our science books. You can see how there's this assumed progression from being a knuckle walker with very long front arms through various stooped postures until you end up with the tall human being. Now, it always cracks me up how they make the last guy have a beard so he looks like the apes that come before him. Right? That's kind of funny, but this is a very common picture. Now, to inject a little humor, here's another similar picture. Are we really moving forward to a newer, better species? Now, I think this came from an article that was lamenting the enormous rate of growth in circumference of people, particularly in America. By the way, there's a very interesting thing that happens to me in Hong Kong. I meet people I've never met, and they ask me whether I'm German or Swedish or British. And I couldn't figure out why, because I don't sound like any of those people. And I finally figured out why. It's because I'm not fat. See, I sound like an American, but I'm not fat. Strange, isn't it? Okay. Well, let's consider some of the responses to Darwin's theory. Okay, Darwin did not publish his theory in a vacuum. Other people before him had offered evolutionary theories, but they weren't very convincing. His theory was embraced largely because of the philosophical and religious climate of his times. And this goes back to our survey of worldviews from our first session, remember? There was a growing rejection of biblical authority due to the Enlightenment. Remember, the Renaissance occurred largely because people returned to a biblical worldview that made them expect the universe to be orderly. But then when people began to be successful in understanding the natural world, they started getting proud, and then we move into the Enlightenment where people are beginning to say, well, we can figure this all out. We really don't need God. By the way, people's success in understanding physical law began to make them doubt the reality of miracles. And that led to doubt in Scripture. Okay, well, Darwin's theory came out in the middle 1800s, and this was very much going on. Okay? There was a growth of deism versus classical biblical theism. Now, I don't remember whether I explained deism to you, but let me give you a quick explanation now. Deism is a kind of theism, but it's often called absent landlord theology. The idea is that there is a single God who created the universe, who created everything in it, but he sort of wound it up like a clock, and he set it going, and he steps back, and he doesn't intervene. Now, deism is a good step toward atheism, because if you embrace a deistic worldview, you're saying, well, yeah, there's a God, but he doesn't care what I do. So once you say there's a God, but he doesn't care what I do, it's very easy to get to the point where you say, well, if there's a God, but he doesn't care what I do, I may as well live as if there is no God. And then people end up saying, well, there is no God. And that is basically what has happened in the last several hundred years. Now, people also had a very mechanistic view of the universe. Remember we talked about Newton and his laws of motion last time? Well, Newton's laws of motion allowed people to come up with a very clear, well-defined, predictable way of understanding the motion of the planets, the motion of the moon around the Earth, the motions of the moons around Jupiter, and that led people to have the confidence that if we just had enough time to figure it out, we could understand everything in the universe by applying Newton's laws of motion. Okay? Well, if the physical universe, moving bodies, are governed purely by natural laws, and there's nothing personal there, it's not that big a step to ask the question, well, is that true of life, too? Now, there are also many simplistic assumptions about the complexity of life. How many of you have ever seen a Frankenstein movie? Okay, that goes back to a story from the 1800s, and the basic idea of the story was that you could take dead bodies and pass electricity through them and make them come to life again. Now, that's basically what Dr. Frankenstein did, right? He assembled a large body from various parts, and he found the right way to pass electricity through it to make it come back to life. Now, when Mary Shelley wrote that book, people did not think that that was a silly idea. There were people who actually expected that we would learn how to animate dead things through the use of electricity. Right? People had an extremely simplistic understanding about the complexity of life. Now, one of the things that's happening in biology today that's absolutely wonderful is that biologists are discovering how complex life is. They're discovering all this stuff about enzymes in the body and DNA and shapes and viruses and programs. You know, they won't use the word program, but the more they study, the more complexity they discover. Okay? People had very simplistic ideas about the complexity of life, and it made it easier to accept Darwin's theory. There was, as we've seen, a prevalence of dialectical and evolutionary thought in other disciplines, including biblical studies. And this is something that most of us today aren't aware of. In the middle 1800s, there was a very widespread belief in racial superiority and inferiority among humans. Now, if you go back and you look at some literature from the late 1800s, you will see places where people of the Negro race are compared to apes. And they draw these sequences, and we've got monkeys, we've got Negroes, and we've got Caucasians and Asians over here. And the idea was that people from the Negroid races were racially inferior, and that racial inferiority came from them being further down the evolutionary ladder. Now, that's a horrible thing. That's a horrible thing. But it was part of the thinking of the times. Okay? And that went along with imperialism, right? The Western world was colonizing the rest of the planet. The Western world had a jump in technology and science, and that made them think that people in other parts of the world were inferior. By the way, a lot of Westerners thought that Chinese were inferior, right? And now, who's running the world? Right? So there's a little payback going on here, I think. Now, let me show you something that you may not be aware of. This is the cover page of an 1882 edition of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. Now, there has been no change in the title of the book. Most people don't know what the total title of the book is. The total title is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Interesting, isn't it? And you can see this whole racial hierarchy idea in his words here. Okay? And we'll see next week that this kind of thinking strongly influenced the world for about the next 80, 100 years with regard to ideas of racial superiority, and they're not all gone yet. And a lot of that was kind of fanned into flame by Darwinism. Now, I'm not saying Darwinism started it, but when his theory came along, people who already had a tendency to believe in racial superiority latched onto this. And many people took this and carried it very, very far. Very scary stuff. All right, well, let's look at some of the evidences for Darwin's theory, and then we're going to look at evidences against it. Okay. A number of observations gave credence to his theory. When his theory came out, in many ways it sounded good. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with exploring scientific theories, right? We saw in our first session that the purpose of a theory, well, actually a hypothesis, is to provide a possible explanation for what you observe. And Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and a number of other places, and he saw what he thought were adaptations of species caused by environmental factors. So he came up with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis ended up being a theory, and today it's essentially treated as a law. But I don't think it's a valid theory, and it's certainly not a law. But here are some of the things. If you look in unusual environments, you find unusual species, right? You've got swimming iguanas in the Galapagos. In other parts of the world, iguanas don't typically swim in the ocean. You've got kangaroos, you've got platypuses in Australia, right? There is evidence of extinct animals in the fossil record, right? Now, people knew about fossils already, but they didn't know why things like dinosaurs don't exist today when they clearly existed a long time ago. Now, Darwin's theory provided a possible explanation for that, right? Another thing that people had observed, in many places where you find fossils, you will find the fossils sorted. They'll be in various layers, and different layers will have different kinds of fossils. And in some places, not all, by the way, in some places, the lower levels seem to have simpler fossils, or fossils of simpler animals. And as you go up, you find more complex fossils, or fossils of more complex animals. And Darwin also noticed that there were structural similarities in different species. If you look at primates and you look at humans, you will see similarities. If you look at various reptiles, you will see similarities. And he took that as evidence that existing species were modified by mutation, and they carried forward some of their characteristics, and then others were changed. Okay, this is a possible explanation of that. Now, Darwin also thought, as most people did in his time, that simple living creatures were simple and complex living creatures are complex. Now, biochemistry is rapidly proving that that's really not true. You go down to very simple animals like sponges, and they are incredibly complex. Right? Now, it's true that vertebrates are more complex, but the variations in complexity are not as great as was assumed in Darwin's day. In Darwin's day, they didn't know about DNA, they had no molecular biology, they were basically working with structural things that they could see under an optical microscope. Right? And Darwin obviously noticed, and many others did, similarities between apes and humans. So with all of these observations giving support to Darwin's theory, his theory quickly took root in the academic world, partly because of the evidence and partly because of the academic and theological climate. Right? It was an idea whose time had come. His timing was very, very good. By the way, if any of you are interested, and next week I'm going to give you a list of good books on the subjects we've been talking about. Here's one called The Dark Side of Darwin. This is basically a study of him through his correspondence with other people and reports of other people. And you find out that Darwin was a very strange man. He really was. He had a lot of weird fears. As a boy, he loved to kill animals. And as I said, you can't make an airtight case for the idea that Darwin created his theory in order to suppress belief in God. There's not enough evidence to do that yet. But if you read this book, you will see that there's at least a hint that that might have been one of his motivations. Okay? It's a fascinating book, The Dark Side of Darwin. Okay? And I'll tell you about more books later. All right. Well, there were some holes in Darwin's theory, and he acknowledged them himself. So, a modification of his theory was developed, which today we call neo-Darwinism. Now, in the modern world, unless you're a scientist, when you say Darwinism, you're talking about neo-Darwinism. Okay, we're going to use the term Darwinism for the rest of this discussion, except for here, because I want you to recognize that other scientists came along and sort of filled in gaps in his theory. Right? This is neo-Darwinism. Okay, now, the first problem was that Darwin had absolutely no explanation for the origin of mutations. He had no idea how they would arrive. He just made this up. He just said, well, I assume that when species A is reproducing, every once in a while a baby pops out that isn't like its parents. There's something fundamentally different about it. Now, other scientists came along and they tried to explain this. One theory was something that has come to be called Lamarckism. Okay, this is named after a man, Lamarck. Now, Lamarck had a theory that animals could be changed by adaptation, and that their adaptations would be passed on to their children. Now, let me give you an example. Let's suppose we've got a population of monkeys, and they're living in the rainforest. And something comes which requires them to leave the rainforest. They're used to climbing around in the trees, they're used to soft ground in the forest, but they're chased to another place where the ground is very rocky. So as these monkeys live and they run around on the rocks, what forms on their feet? Calluses, right? We form calluses, right? And Lamarck's theory was that such acquired characteristics would be passed on to the offspring, so that when these monkeys produced baby monkeys, they would be born with calluses. Okay? That's basically Lamarckism. Now, scientists rapidly discovered that this doesn't work. By the way, there's an interesting story from the Soviet Union in the 1930s about a scientist called T.D. Lysenko, who adapted Lamarckism and tried to use it to develop new kinds of wheat that would grow in the cold Russian climate. And he had so much political clout that even though other scientists were saying, this is stupid, it doesn't work, he got them executed or deported or sent to Siberia. And for a brief period of time, Soviet science was under the control of Lamarckism. Now eventually, they realized it was wrong and they threw it away. Okay? This theory did not work. So, with the growth of understanding in genetics, the idea that has supplied this problem today is the idea that random damage to the genetic code provides mutations. Now, we've all seen movies in which people get subjected to nuclear radiation, and they grow to be 10 times taller than others and things like that. I used to work around nuclear radiation when I was doing physics research, and we worked very hard to avoid being exposed to it, because nuclear radiation does not do nice things to people. By the way, if you're wondering what nuclear radiation does, nuclear radiation is either X-rays, or gamma rays, which are very high frequency radio waves, which, your dentist uses them to examine your teeth, right? They go right through your body. Heavy doses of those will dump large amounts of energy in your body, and they'll basically do one of two things. They'll either cause heat damage, which will be burns, or if the frequency is right, they will cause molecules to vibrate in such a way that the molecules break apart. And when you have broken molecules in your system, they become toxins. And then they're floating around in your blood and in your cellular tissues, and they basically poison you. Now, the other kind of radiation is particle radiation. Particle radiation can be neutrons, protons, electrons, pieces of atoms that are flying at very high speed. Now, they do the same thing as gamma rays and X-rays. When they hit living tissue, they can either break molecules apart, releasing pieces of molecules that are toxic, or they can cause burns. Right? Radiation doesn't turn people into 200-foot tall monsters. Right? But radiation can damage genes. All right, we do know that. And it is possible that radiation can produce mutants through damage to the genetic code. We know that can happen. Right? Now, the second hole in Darwin's theory was that Darwin had no explanation for how the characteristics of the new mutant would be passed on to its offspring. Why would its offspring be like it was? Now again, Lamarckism was tried. That was the idea that acquired characteristics were transmitted, but that was quickly disproved. And so now the theory says that the modified genes which the mutant somehow received that make it a mutant are then passed on to its children. Okay? Now, lastly, this was a big one. There's no evidence of intermediate forms in the fossil record. Now, many of you have heard of the missing links, right? Well, Darwinism is sort of like a chain. Species A mutates into species B, which is selected, mutates into species C, which is selected, and you go on and on and on. But remember, it's a chain with very, very tiny links, because the mutations have to be small, because if they're too big, the animal isn't going to survive. Okay? Now, Darwin's theory suggested that when we look in the fossil record, we should see a continuous spectrum of changing animals instead of seeing horses and antelopes and tigers. We should see things in between. No one has ever found any of those in-between things. Now, when you hear the term missing link, you usually think of the link between apes and humans. But the reality is, there are missing links between all different species. There is no spectrum of intermediate forms to be found anywhere in the fossil record. Now, this problem hasn't really been solved yet, but there are two theories that have been offered, and we'll talk about them later. They're called punctuated equilibrium and episodic evolution. I'm not going to go into those right now, but I will go into them later. Okay? Let's talk about time and Darwinism. When Darwin came out with his theory, most geologists accepted flood geology. Now, by the way, their belief in flood geology was not based only on the fact that they were familiar with the Bible. There is tons of evidence to suggest that the earth was once flooded by a worldwide flood. Lots and lots of evidence. So when Darwin came out with his theory, most scientists believed that the earth was between 5,000 and 20,000 years old. Okay, now, the figure 5,000, this is close to what you would calculate if you went through the genealogies of the book of Genesis and tried to figure out the age of the earth that way. There was a guy named Bishop Ussher who did that, and he came to the conclusion that the earth was created around 4,400 BC or something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a little less than 5,000 years BC. Now, many scientists didn't take that number seriously, but they looked at processes that could be measured and things like erosion rates, the rate at which salt is increasing in the oceans, and they came to the conclusion that the earth was somewhere between 5 and maybe 20,000 years old. Now, with that assumption, they said, well, okay, Darwin's theory says that all life developed within the span of time that the earth existed. That must mean that evolution is a pretty fast process. So they looked around and they said, you know, we should see new species appearing in the next 5 to 10 years. And nothing showed up. And they looked and looked and looked and nothing showed up. So now they've got a problem with time. And they began to say, maybe the earth is a lot older than we assumed it was. Okay? So Darwinists began to push geologists to provide evidence that the earth is old enough to accommodate Darwinian evolution. Now, Bible believers, people who were still confident in the truth of Scripture, adopted two different strategies. And you can see these today. To continue to defend the young earth view, or to find ways to fit an old earth and or Darwinian evolution with biblical teaching. Okay, these are the basic strategies that Christians take today. Either insist that the earth is young and hold to the creation account and reject the whole Darwinian idea, or accept the possibility that the earth is old and possibly accept Darwinism. Now, you don't have to accept Darwinism to believe in an old earth. Okay? It's possible to be a creationist and believe in an old earth. Right? But these are the two basic strategies. And we're going to talk more about these next week. Now, let's talk a little bit more about time before we have our break. Okay? Now, that wasn't supposed to show up yet, so ignore that. That's not there. Okay. Because the strongest support for Darwinism was found in the fossil record, a very strange cycle of adjustments began to be made in the scientific world. Now, ages of rock strata were estimated on the basis of the fossils that were found in them and the assumed sequence of Darwinism. Okay. Now, when Darwin's theory demanded more time for evolution, the assumed ages of those rock strata were increased. And geologists were driven to justify an increasingly older Earth as evolutionists pushed evolution further back in time. Now, do you see how this works? They expected, let me blank this out for a minute. They expected that we would see new species in 5 to 10 years. They don't show up. So the process must be slower. 30 years later, they don't show up. The process must be even slower. Okay? And by the way, people are doing experiments. They're trying to cause evolution to occur, and it's not occurring. People are looking for mutants, and they're not finding any beneficial mutations anywhere. By the way, we're more than 150 years from Darwin's theory, and no natural beneficial mutation has ever been observed. And I guarantee you that scientists are looking very, very hard for it. Okay? So there's this funny thing going on. Now, today, evolutionists date fossils by assumed ages of rocks, and geologists date rocks by the assumed ages of fossils. Does that sound funny to you? Yeah, it's circular reasoning, okay? Now, let me say in fairness, scientists have discovered other evidences that were not known at the time of Darwin that do suggest that the Earth and universe are older than was previously assumed. And we will talk about those things next week. So I don't want to give you the impression that scientists are just making up things out of the blue to support this theory. Scientists have been convinced that this is a viable theory, and they're looking for evidence to support it. That's perfectly natural. But things get a little unnatural when you've got this circular reasoning going on. Okay? All right. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the problem of time, because creationists have a problem with time too. Today, the established scientific community argues that the universe is billions of years old. The present number is about 15-something billion years old, and the Earth is believed to be about 5.5 billion years old. Now, here are some of the evidences that they cite. They talk about time needed for evolution. They talk about starlight from stars millions of light years away, and even farther. They talk about radiographic dating techniques. We'll talk about this next week. Carbon-14, potassium, argon, things like that. They talk about the uniformitarian hypothesis. I will explain this to you in the next hour. They talk about continental drift. They talk about the formation of fossils. They talk about the time it takes to form fossil fuels, how long it takes to form oil underground. And they talk about the creation of geological structures on the Earth, like river canyons and the mountains, okay? Many people go to the Grand Canyon in the US or other canyons in other parts of the world, and we look at them and we're told that it took millions and millions of years for this river to cut down and produce this canyon, okay? Now these are important issues, and we will return to them in the problem of time, probably next week, all right? Thanks for watching. If you have enjoyed or benefited from this study of science in the Bible, I hope you'll recommend this series to others. Please also like, subscribe, and share. See you in the next part of the series.